The man who knocked on Rachel Dunn's door that cool Oregon morning was wearing a worn brown coat with a frayed cuff and patched trousers and boots that had seen better years. The man said his name was Nate Carver. The man said he was a drifter looking for honest work through the harvest, and that he would take low wages and a place to sleep in the barn, and that he was strong and willing and asked only for a fair chance. Every word of that was a lie. Well, almost every word. He was strong and he was willing. But his name was not Nate Carver. His name was Jonas Ashford, and Jonas Ashford was the richest man in Harmony Valley. I want you to know that from the very first minute, because Rachel Dunn did not know it, and the whole of this story lives in the space between what Rachel knew and what you and I know. Jonas Ashford owned the great Ashford Ranch that spread across the whole north end of the valley, 11,000 acres of the best grass in Oregon, more cattle than a man could count in a day's riding. Jonas Ashford had borrowed that worn brown coat from one of his own hired men. Jonas had left his fine horse tied a mile down the road and walked the rest on foot, so that he would arrive at Rachel Dunn's door looking like a man who owned nothing in the world. Rachel Dunn looked the stranger over from her doorway. Rachel was 32. Rachel was a widow. Rachel was running her late husband's small farm alone, and running it into the ground, if she was honest, because one woman cannot do the work of a man and a woman both, no matter how hard she tries. Rachel needed a hired hand badly, and Rachel could barely afford to feed one, let alone pay him. So Rachel said, plainly, because Rachel was a plain-speaking woman, "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Carver. I can offer you the barn to sleep in, and 3 meals a day, and just about no money at all, because there isn't any." The rich man's pockets. And Jonas Ashford, the rich man whose pockets Rachel was sending him toward, kept his face still and said, "3 meals and a dry barn suits me fine, ma'am. I'm not particular about wages. I'd rather work for someone who needs the help than someone who's just got money to spend." Which was the truest thing Jonas had said since he walked up, and Rachel had no way of knowing it. So Rachel Dunn hired Jonas Ashford to work her failing farm, never dreaming that the poor drifter sleeping in her barn could have bought her whole valley twice over without noticing the cost. And Jonas Ashford settled into the barn with a borrowed coat and a false name, to find out the one thing all his money had never been able to buy him: whether a woman could care for him when she believed he had nothing at all to give. To understand why a man as rich as Jonas Ashford would borrow a poor man's coat and lie about his name, you have to know about a woman named Clarissa, and a thing Jonas overheard once that broke something in him that had never fully mended. So let me tell you, Jonas Ashford had not always been rich. Jonas had built the Ashford Ranch up from a middling spread his father left him. Built it with 20 years of hard, smart, relentless work, until Jonas was the wealthiest man for 100 miles. And somewhere in those 20 years, Jonas had become a prize. Not a man, a prize. Every family in the valley with a marriageable daughter looked at Jonas Ashford and saw 11,000 acres. When Jonas was younger, he had nearly married. Her name was Clarissa. She was beautiful and charming, and she had pursued Jonas with a warmth that had made him feel, for a while, like the luckiest man alive. Jonas had loved her. Jonas had been ready to give her everything. Then, 2 weeks before the wife, Clarissa said, laughing, "Love him? Heavens, no. But a girl can learn to put up with a great deal for 11,000 acres. I'd marry a far worse man than Jonas Ashford for that ranch." Those were Clarissa's words. Remember them. Love him? Heavens, no. A girl can learn to put up with a great deal for 11,000 acres. Jonas Ashford stood frozen in that hallway and felt 20 years of work curdle into something cold. He had thought he was loved. He was only valued. He was a ranch with a man attached, and the man was the part nobody wanted. Jonas broke off the engagement, and after that, Jonas could never again look at a woman's warmth toward him without hearing Clarissa's voice underneath it, asking the cold arithmetic question, love him or love the acres? Every smile became suspect. Every kindness, a possible calculation. Jonas grew rich and richer, and lonelier, locked inside a wealth that had become a wall between him and the one thing he wanted, which was to be wanted plainly, for himself, by someone who did not know or care what he owned. Now here is where Rachel Dunn comes into it. Jonas had met Rachel once, months before, though Rachel would not have remembered it. It was in town, outside the feed store. Jonas, as himself, as the great Mr. Ashford, had been surrounded as usual by the small crowd of people who always gathered when he came to town, the merchants being extra friendly, the mothers steering their daughters into his path. And in the middle of all that fawning, Rachel Dunn had walked past, loading feed sacks into her own wagon by herself, and Rachel had glanced at the great Mr. Ashford and his little crowd with an expression of plain, faint disinterest, and gone right on loading her. He learned that Rachel Dunn was a widow, struggling alone on a small farm, too proud to ask for help and too stubborn to sell. And Jonas Ashford, who had spent years being loved for his acres, became fascinated by the one woman who had looked at his acres and shrugged. So Jonas hatched his foolish, hopeful plan. He would go to Rachel Dunn not as the rich Mr. Ashford, the prize, the 11,000 acres. He would go as Nate Carver, a poor drifter with a frayed cuff and nothing to offer but his 2 hands, and he would find out, once and for all, whether a woman could care for the man when there were no acres in the picture at all. It was a deception. I will not pretend it was not. But it was a deception born of a deep wound, a man so starved to be wanted for himself that he was willing to hide everything he had to find out if anything was left of him underneath it. Rachel Dunn, of course, knew none of this. Rachel had a failing farm and a dead husband and a mountain of work and a new hired hand who said his name was Nate and worked harder than any man she could afford. Rachel had no reason on earth to imagine that the quiet, willing drifter in her barn was anyone but exactly who he claimed to be. And so Rachel simply did what Rachel did with everyone. Rachel treated him with plain decency, never dreaming it was the most important thing anyone had done for that man in 20 years. The first thing Rachel Dunn did, on Nate Carver's first evening, was refuse to let him eat in the barn. Jonas had carried his plate out toward the barn after supper was dished up, the way a hired hand was expected to, the way Jonas had seen his own hands do at the Ashford Ranch 1,000 times without ever thinking about it. And Rachel called after him sharp, "Where do you think you're going with that plate?" Jonas said he figured he'd eat out of her way, and Rachel Dunn, "Table and a roof. Sit down and eat like a person. Remember that. No one eats alone on my place." To Rachel Dunn it was nothing, just plain manners, the way she had been raised. To Jonas Ashford it landed like a blow to the chest, because Jonas, the richest man in the valley, ate alone nearly every night of his life, at a long table in a fine house, in a silence as cold as Clarissa's voice. And here was a poor widow with almost nothing, who would not let a penniless stranger eat by himself in a barn, because no one ate alone on her place. Jonas sat down at Rachel's small table that night and ate Rachel's plain food, and felt something he had not felt in 20 years. He felt like a person, not a prize. So began the weeks of the test that Rachel Dunn did not know she was taking, and you and I, knowing what Rachel did not, got to watch every day as Rachel passed it, without the faintest idea there was anything to pass. Rachel worked beside Nate in the fields, because Rachel was not the kind of woman to sit in the house while a man did the labor. And as they worked, Rachel talked to him, plain and easy, the way you talk to someone you have decided is decent. Rachel asked Nate his opinions and listened to the answers. Rachel shared the water and the shade and the last of the morning coffee without keeping count. When Nate did a thing well, Rachel said so. When the work was hard, Rachel did her share of it and never asked Nate to carry hers. Jonas Ashford had owned hundreds of hired men over the years and had never once worked a field beside one as an equal. Now Jonas spent his days laboring next to a woman who treated him as exactly that, an equal, a partner in the hard work of keeping a place alive. And Jonas began to understand that he had been starving for something for 20 years and had never known what to call it. It was not love, not yet. There was the matter of the brown coat, too. The worn brown coat Jonas had borrowed to play poor in. One cold morning, Rachel saw Nate shivering in that thin, frayed coat. And that evening, Rachel brought out a coat of her own, a good, heavy wool coat, and held it out to him. "This was my husband's," Rachel said. "Daniel was about your size. It's no good to anybody hanging on a peg, and you'll catch your death in that thin thing. Take it." And Jonas Ashford, who owned a closet full of the finest coats money could buy, stood in a poor widow's kitchen and was undone by the gift of a dead man's wool coat, freely given by a woman who thought she was giving away the only warm coat on the place. Remember the coat. Remember that Rachel gave away warmth she could not spare, to a stranger she believed had nothing. There was a day in town that Jonas never forgot either. Rachel had taken Nate along to help load supplies, and outside the mercantile a pair of well-dressed townsmen looked the drifter up and down, taking in the frayed coat and the patched trousers, and one of them said something low and unkind about Rachel taking in any stray that wandered up her lane. Rachel Dunn heard it, and Rachel turned on those two men with her chin up and said, "Plain as day, this man has done more honest work on my place in a month than either of you has done in your lives. I'll thank you to keep your opinions about my hired help behind your teeth." And the two men went red and found somewhere else to be. Jonas Ashford stood holding a sack of feed and watched a poor widow defend his dignity to men who would have bowed and scraped to him if they had known his real name. He had been flattered by powerful men his whole life. He had never once been defended by anyone. It was, he thought, the difference between being valued and being cared for, and he was only now at his age. Jonas, as Nate, worked harder than two ordinary hands. Jonas mended fences that had been broken for years. Jonas got the failing well pump working again. Jonas coaxed more out of that tired little farm in a month than Rachel had managed in a year, and Rachel, watching her place slowly come back to life under this drifter's hands, was grateful in a way that went deep, because Rachel had been so alone with the work for so long. But Jonas had to be careful, and being careful cost him, because Jonas Ashford could have fixed everything. Jonas could have, with a single word and a fraction of his money, paid off Rachel's debts, restocked her herd, hired her 10 men, rebuilt her barn. Jonas had to stand by and watch Rachel scrimp and worry and go without, when he could have ended all of it in an afternoon, because to end it would be to reveal himself, and to reveal himself would be to never know if she had cared for the man or only the rescue. It was a strange torment, to be a rich man pretending to be poor while the woman he was falling for went hungry beside him. More than once Jonas nearly broke and told her everything. More than once the cold memory of Clarissa's voice stopped him. Love him or love the acres? He had to know. So he held his tongue, and the test went on. The thing that brought it all to a head was the mortgage. Rachel Dunn's late husband, Daniel, had borrowed against the farm years before, and the note had come due, and Rachel did not have the money, not nearly. The bank in town, which happened to be a bank Jonas Ashford did a great deal of business with, sent word that Rachel had 30 days to pay the balance or lose the farm. Rachel read that letter at her own kitchen table, with her face gone white, and Jonas, sitting across from her in his dead man's coat, watched the woman he loved face the loss of the only thing she had left of her old life. Hear Rachel's note before breakfast, and never feel the cost. The money meant nothing to him. Rachel meant everything, and he could not do it without throwing off the disguise and risking the answer to the only question that had ever mattered to him. That night, Jonas paced the barn until well past midnight, wrestling with himself. He had his answer about Rachel, did he not? He had watched her for weeks. He had seen her share her last coffee and give away her dead husband's coat and refuse to let a stranger eat alone. He knew in his bones that Rachel Dunn was the realest, kindest, least calculating person he had ever met. The test was passed. He could see that plainly. So why not simply tell her, save the farm, and be done with the deception? And the answer, the honest answer, was that Jonas was afraid. Not afraid anymore that Rachel was like Clarissa, Afraid of something else now. Afraid that when Rachel learned he had lied to her for 2 months, had let her feed him and worry over wages she could not pay, and give away her coat, all while he sat on 11,000 acres laughing up his sleeve, Rachel would be hurt and angry and would never trust him again. The deception that had begun as a test had become a trap of his own making, and Jonas understood, pacing that barn, that there was no clean way out of it. There was only a hard way, and he had better take it soon, before the farm was lost. But Jonas was a day too slow in his courage, and the truth nearly came out the wrong way first. Because the very next afternoon, a rider came up the lane to Rachel's farm, and it was one of the Ashford foremen, a man named Pruitt, sent out to find Mr. Ashford, who had been mysteriously absent from his own ranch for weeks. Pruitt rode up, spotted Jonas in the field, and called out, in plain hearing of Rachel, "Mr. Ashford! There you are, sir. The whole ranch has been turned upside down looking for you." Rachel Dunn went still. Rachel looked at her hired hand, her drifter, her Nate Carver, and Rachel looked at the foreman calling him Mr. Ashford, sir. And Rachel Dunn, who was nobody's fool, put it together in about 3 seconds. The richest man in the valley, sleeping in her barn, eating at her table, wearing her dead husband's coat, letting her fret over wages and mortgages and the loss of her home, when he could have bought it all without blinking. "Mr. Ashford," Rachel said. Her voice was very quiet, which was worse than if she had shouted. "Mr. Ashford, is that so?" She set down the tool she was holding. "You've been Jonas Ashford this whole time, sleeping in my barn, eating my food, letting me give you Daniel's coat off the peg because I thought you'd freeze." Rachel's voice shook now, with a hurt deeper than anger. "I gave you the only warm coat on this place, and you own half of Oregon. What kind of man does that? What kind of man lets a struggling woman pity him?" And Jonas Ashford stood in the field with his secret broken open, the worst possible way, and saw the hurt on Rachel's face, and knew he had earned every bit of it. There was no carriage that could fix this, no fortune, no grand gesture. Jonas understood, in that terrible moment, that the only thing that might save what he had broken was the plain truth, told plainly, and an apology that did not hide behind his money any more than his lie had. "Send your foreman away," Rachel said low, "and then you are going to tell me the truth, all of it. And then you are going to pack that coat, my husband's coat, and you are going to leave my place, Mr. Ashford, because I do not abide being made of." And then Jonas Ashford turned to face the only person whose opinion of him had ever truly mattered, with nothing left to hide behind. Jonas Ashford told Rachel Dunn the whole truth, standing in her field in the late afternoon light. He told her about Clarissa, and the words he had overheard, and the wound that had never healed. He told her about being a prize and not a man, about eating alone every night at a long, cold table, about the years of warmth he could never trust because he could never tell whether it was for him or for his acres. And then Jonas told her about the day outside the feed store, when Rachel had walked past the great Mr. Ashford and his little fawning crowd, and looked at him with plain disinterest, and gone on loading her own feed sacks. "You were the only person in this valley who ever looked at me and didn't see 11,000 acres, Jonas said. "You looked at me and saw nothing you needed. Do you have any idea what that was worth to a man like me? I had to know if you could care for the man with nothing, because the man with everything has never once been loved in his whole life. That is why I lied to you, Rachel. It was a coward's way to find a brave thing. And it was wrong, and I am sorrier than I have words for." Rachel Dunn listened to all of it with her arms crossed and her jaw set. And when Jonas was done, Rachel was quiet a long moment. Then Rachel said, "I understand why you did it. That does not make it right. You let me pity you, Jonas. You let me give and give out of the little I had. And the whole time you were the richest man in the valley. A person's pride is about all I had left, and you spent 2 months letting me spend mine on a man who didn't need it." "I know," Jonas said. "You gave me your husband's coat. I have never in my life owned anything worth as much as that coat. because it was the only thing anybody ever gave me without first counting what I could give back. And it was not the carriage, and it was not the 11,000 acres. It was the apology. It was a proud rich man standing in a poor woman's field, admitting he had been a coward and a fool, and not once, in all his explaining, asking Rachel to forgive him because of what he could now do for her. Jonas did not say, "Marry me and I'll save your farm." Jonas did not wave his fortune at the hurt he had caused. Jonas just owned the wrong, plainly, and stood there in the wreckage of his own foolish plan, asking nothing. And that, finally, was what Rachel Dunn could not turn away from. Because a man who leads with his money is a man like all the others who had ever circled Jonas Ashford. But a man who stands in a field and says I was wrong and asks for nothing, that is a man being a person, not a prize. That is the man Rachel had been feeding at her table for 2 months. The lie had been Jonas Ashford's. But the man underneath the lie, the man who worked her fields and fixed her well and could not bear to eat alone, that man had been real the whole time. Rachel saw it. Rachel had always seen it. She had just not known his name. It was a week later that the carriage came. Rachel had told Jonas to leave, and Jonas had left, and gone back to his cold, long table, and given Rachel her week of space because she had asked for it, and he had finally learned to do what she asked. And then, on a bright morning, a fine carriage came up Rachel Dunn's lane, and Jonas Ashford stepped down from it. But he was not wearing his rich man's finery. Jonas was wearing the worn brown coat, the frayed one he had arrived in. He had left the dead man's coat folded clean on her porch the day she sent him away. Jonas Ashford walked up to Rachel's door in his poor man's coat, and he did not bring his fortune to the door, and he did not bring a speech about acres. Old coat, because the man asking is the same one who slept in your barn and ate at your table, not the one with the acres. You can have the carriage or not, Rachel, the acres or not. But I am asking, plainly, for the first honest time, will you have the man? And Rachel Dunn, who had looked at the richest man in the valley once and seen nothing she needed, looked at this man in his frayed brown coat, asking plainly, hiding nothing, and saw, at last, the one thing she had needed all along and never expected to find. "Come in, Jonas," Rachel said, "and sit down at the table. You know the rule. No one eats alone on my place." And that, in Rachel Dunn's way, was a yes. Jonas Ashford and Rachel Dunn were married that autumn, and the valley talked of nothing else for a season, because the richest man in Oregon had married the proud little widow next door, and most folks could not understand how it had come about. They did not know about the barn, or the borrowed coat, or the 2 months when the richest man in the valley had been the poorest hired hand on a failing farm. That story stayed between Jonas and Rachel, where it belonged. Rachel did not lose her farm, of course. But here is the thing about that, the thing that mattered to Rachel. Jonas did not pay off her mortgage as a grand gift to win her. The mortgage got paid only after Rachel had already said yes to the man in the frayed coat. Only after the asking was done, and answered with nothing on the table but the man himself. Rachel had needed to choose Jonas before the acres ever entered into it, and she had. So when the acres came after all, they came clean, the way a thing comes when you did not choose it for itself. They kept Rachel's little farm, alongside the great Ashford ranch. Rachel would not sell it. Wool coat, the warm one Rachel had given away to a freezing stranger, hung back on its peg in the little farmhouse where it belonged, and neither of them ever gave it away again. Remember Clarissa, and the words that broke something in Jonas Ashford long ago. Love him? Heavens, no. A girl can learn to put up with a great deal for 11,000 acres. For 20 years those words had been the truest thing Jonas believed about himself, that he was a ranch with a man attached, and the man was the part nobody wanted. It took a poor widow who would not let him eat alone in a barn to finally drown out Clarissa's voice, because Rachel Dunn had chosen the man when she believed there were no acres at all, and a man who has been chosen like that, once, truly, for himself, never has to wonder again. The long, cold table in the big house was never cold again. Jonas Ashford had spent 20 years eating alone in a fine house, hearing Clarissa's arithmetic in every kindness, certain that all his money had bought him was a wall, and then a plain-spoken woman with a failing farm and a warm coat to spare had said 6 words that turned out to be worth more than 11,000 acres. No one eats alone on my place. And no one ever did again.